Good afternoon and welcome to the Committee for Workers International, CWI, live weekly broadcasts offering a socialist alternative view of the current global capitalist crisis and the pandemic. In the last week, we've seen an intensification of the crisis around the world. We've seen here in Britain, members of the governing board of the Bank of England predicting that the UK could go into its deepest slump for 300 years. At the same time, we've seen the terrible consequences that this economic slump internationally is having on the working people of the world. We've seen increasing protests. Yesterday we saw rioting take place in Lebanon, where the banks have been attacked. We've seen demonstrations by medical staff demanding better protective equipment, who've been viciously attacked by the riot police there. In Santiago, demonstrators have taken back to the streets again, although in smaller numbers, maintaining social distancing, but at the same time have been victims of horrific repression. Even yesterday we saw the incredible feat that they arrested the grandson of the former socialist president Salvador Allende. At the same time, in many countries we've seen increased walkouts by workers in different plants and workplaces. In the United States, we've seen a whole series of strikes and protests organised by workers at Amazon and also at General Electric and other countries as well, and other countries and other companies around the globe. But today, we're going to concentrate on where the pandemic is currently hitting hardest, where the economic crisis is having a devastating effect in the richest and the most powerful of the imperialist powers in the world, that is the United States. And of course, to get further information and further background to the analysis of the CWI, we'd encourage all of our viewers to go to our webpage at socialistworld.net. And also today, for our viewers in the United States, you can visit the website of the Independent Socialist Group at independentsocialistgroup.org. And today we're joined by three members of the Independent Socialist Group in the United States. That's Tanya Whitworth, a member of the Graduate Employee Union United Auto Workers Local 2322, by Chavis, a student and a teaching assistant and activist in the US, and Evren Pallares, a worker at UPS and a member of the Teamsters Local 170. So welcome to all of you three who've joined us in this debate and discussion today on developments in the US. So maybe we could begin by turning to Tanya and ask to explain the current situation in the US. We've had now in the US the highest number of deaths recorded in the world, 56,000, 17,000 of those registered in New York. We see a devastating recession, which many economists are saying is the worst since the 1930s, where unemployment is anticipated to hit 30%. Food banks have exploded, homelessness has become rife. Joseph Stiglitz, the US economist, has warned that the US under Trump in some areas is heading for third world conditions. So Tanya, could you outline exactly what is happening in the US at the present time, what the situation is as far as the virus is concerned, how it's impacting both in terms of the health and the economic situation facing US workers today?
Absolutely. What's important to understand about the US context is that before the coronavirus hit, the majority of Americans did not have enough in savings to cover a $400 emergency expense, like a medical procedure, for example, car repair, home repair, etc. And so the Americans were already in a very precarious position to start with before this crisis. We also have a private healthcare system, and that is being exacerbated by the fact that millions of Americans have been laid off following the general economic shutdown, leaving them without their employer-provided insurance, right when, of course, the pandemic is hospitalizing thousands of people. And some people are dying from coronavirus because medical companies, hospitals are refusing to provide testing and treatment without insurance. So between the 27 million Americans who were already uninsured, the 31 million Americans who were already uninsured, and the estimated 35 million who will lose insurance due to the pandemic, a huge portion of U.S. society will have to face difficult decisions here. If their family catches coronavirus, which is worse, right? To take your chances with the virus at home or risk bankruptcy by seeking medical treatment. At the same time, the majority in the U.S. actually think that the federal government should be responsible for providing health care. Along similar lines, social services, which have been cut to the bone over the past decades due to neoliberalism, are being stretched to their absolute breaking point. And so we're seeing record numbers of applicants for unemployment, long lines at food banks, well past their capacity. So you may have seen photos of miles of cars lined up, people waiting to get food from food banks. And the food banks are reporting that they don't have enough food for everyone who now needs it. Homelessness was already a problem in the U.S., and we're seeing huge vulnerability of homeless individuals to the virus. So in Boston, 1 in 3 among the homeless has tested positive with coronavirus. Some cities and states are taking steps like moratoriums on evictions or using hotels or other empty housing to house the homeless. But this has been on a small scale so far, and we really need to see that on a mass scale. Finally, recovery from the last recession wasn't real for the working class in the U.S. And as I mentioned before, many of us not having enough to cover a $400 expense. So the stimulus package that's been passed by the federal government has given workers $1,200 each, which is really not enough. That's a one-time payment, and people need much more than that. Additionally, many people aren't getting those stimulus checks for a variety of reasons. The people who aren't getting them tend to be the poorest, people who don't have bank accounts with direct deposit set up, some of the elderly. So people who are really the most vulnerable are not getting their stimulus checks at all. And then finally, around the country, we're seeing that Trump and other capitalist forces are pushing for a premature return to work on May 1st, willing to sacrifice lives in a desperate attempt to stave off the worst of the economic and political crisis. And really, this shows us that the bosses are willing to sacrifice our lives to protect their profit. And with the economy entering a death spiral, the capitalist class wants our labor power back in the equation to try and avoid the worst of the coming crash.
No, it's clearly a devastating position. I mean, 1 in 3 of the homeless being infected with the virus, a payment of $1,200 as a one-off payment into those workers that have suffered the devastating consequences of this recession is obviously totally inadequate. Now, Jai, maybe you could comment on something, because in all countries we see the reports clearly indicating that it's the poorest sections of the population, particularly the working class, which are hardest hit by the virus and by the crisis. But in particular in the US, that has affected the Black and Latino communities. Why is that, Jai? Could you maybe amplify on that?
Yeah, certainly. To give a bit of sort of perspective of how kind of severe the crisis has been in major metropolitan areas where a lot of Black and Latino workers are concentrated. In Chicago, for example, Black people are 6 times as likely to die due to coronavirus than their white counterparts. And in Milwaukee, a similar disparity is seen somewhere more in the ballpark of 3 times as likely. And there are many issues that sort of go into this, but one major issue is this question of access to healthcare. Like Tanya was mentioning, in the U.S., our healthcare is largely tied. If you have healthcare in the first place, and before the crisis, there were 30 million people that didn't have any healthcare at all. But if you do have healthcare, the majority of people that do have it, it's tied to their jobs, to their employment, and even then, it's really considered a luxury. Healthcare benefits generally only are given to full-time employees. But given sort of the huge explosion in the sort of the post-2007, 2008 crash of low-wage, part-time, precarious work that really lacks decent wages, let alone healthcare benefits of any kind, and the fact that majority historically poor Black and Latino workers were this was really all that was available to them post the crash, and even before then as well. They're disproportionately affected in working these low quality, low benefit jobs, and didn't really have great access to healthcare in the first place. There are some state sort of programs, but those are incredibly sort of heterogeneous. Many of them are woefully inadequate in terms of their amount of coverage, unless you live in like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, or a few other states. State healthcare is really chronically underfunded, and in some states hardly even exists at all. So then if you add in and then you add in the fact that Black and Latino workers that did have healthcare, many of them have been laid off due to the sort of the massive unemployment spike that we've seen of 26 million people now jobless in the U.S. It creates a pretty stark picture. And then compounding onto this is many pre-existing health disparities due to a history of food insecurity in many of these communities, food deserts in particular, in which access to decent things, simple things like vegetables and fruit, it just is not available, especially when many people in these communities that are sort of more poor do not have access to a car, and we have completely garbage public transportation in the U.S. It's in many places it's non-existent, especially if you live in more rural areas. Black and Latino workers have historically had less access to clean water, more likely to exist in worse air quality, higher likelihood to live in polluted environments, which all sort of culminates, all these factors kind of culminate into much higher rates of asthma, hypertension, heart disease, and other pre-existing diseases that have been concretely tied, at least in preliminary evidence that seems to be borne out, to having a much worse coronavirus infection and being much more likely to die from it. And there have also been anecdotal examples of, racist prioritizing of coronavirus care in the first place, because what we're seeing very clearly is rationing, because capitalism is completely unprepared to deal with the crisis internationally. That's also true in the U.S. There was one story that I saw about a Black woman at a hospital in, I forget exactly where it was. I want to say it was Milwaukee, who was refused receiving a COVID-19 test and therefore refused care for COVID-19 because she was deemed to not be a priority by the doctors, despite clearly being sick and needing treatment. And as a result of these doctors' neglect, she died days later due to coronavirus complications. And given the history of racism, in not just in terms of access to healthcare, but also in how it's implemented in the U.S., this likely is not just an anecdotal example. There's also been Native American reservations, indigenous peoples. They sort of have their own healthcare systems on their protected lands, and these have been chronically underfunded for years. And the federal government has generally refused to improve funding, including during the pandemic, to these to indigenous people's healthcare. And this has resulted in a particularly acute crisis in many Native American communities, especially the Navajo Nation, which has had more deaths from coronavirus than 13 states, despite only numbering to be about 175,000 people total, which is truly horrific. Connecting to this point about stimulus checks and lack of access to them, in Puerto Rico, which is a territory of the U.S., really it's a colony of the U.S., they've been largely left out of the stimulus bills. No one living in Puerto Rico, as current estimates show, have received a single stimulus check, despite the fact that every Puerto Rican is an American citizen. And there's likely a similar phenomenon going on in other territories like Guam and Samoa. There's also the factor of, due to the ongoing history of racist policing, the prison population is majority Black and Latino in the U.S., and prisons have become major hotspots for the virus, particularly in Louisiana, New York City, on Rikers Island, and in Ohio as well. and these are deeply exacerbated by just really the terrible sanitation conditions that have existed and continue to exist in prisons, as well as these sort of massive open floor plans where 6 people to a cubby, but you have an entire room of hundreds of people all sleeping in the same airspace in the same room. It just creates, it's truly impossible to engage in social distancing and prevent the spread. And then you add the fact that people don't even have access to basic hand washing much of the time. Soap is a luxury. In many prisons, the most they've done is given people a bar of soap a week, which is woefully inadequate. Hand sanitizer is literally banned as contraband in most prisons. And wardens have been completely resistant mostly to changing that sort of policy. And fundamentally, there's been this this sort of federalist approach to the topic of dealing with how coronavirus is impacting prisons, in which creates this very scattered and very limited, taking to task, reducing the prison population where possible, and actually improving these sanitation conditions. And a similar phenomenon is going on in immigrant detention centers as well, which house immigrants.
An absolutely devastating situation there, Jaya, evidently. Now, you emphasised there the question of the healthcare system, which is obviously a crucial issue, particularly in the United States, but indeed everywhere. Now, we've seen reports here which are incredible, that in the midst of this pandemic, we've had the furloughing of nursing staff in Massachusetts and in Worcester. I mean, not even under the madness of Boris Johnson's or Jair Bolsonaro's rule have they gone that far to see that sort of incredible policy implemented. Now, as I understand, there were protests against that when it took place, and Evren, you were involved in some of that, I think, so maybe you could explain to the viewers what happened, how the protest developed, and how on earth did they get to a situation of furloughing nursing staff in the midst of a pandemic? So is Evren there? Because I mean, it was
Evren, you're unmuted.
Oh, my apologies. Yeah, so it is very sad that this is happening, and it's also not just happening in Worcester, Massachusetts. It's a trend that's happening throughout the United States, where we see hospitals either doing a variety of measurements to basically fire healthcare workers straight out or furlough them, like we're seeing them at St. Vincent's Hospital. There's also been pay cuts, believe it or not, in specific private healthcare companies. And on top of the whole, healthcare workers in general, doctors, nurses, assistants, even people who are doing administrative work at the desks, which is very important. Having to work long hours. Some of them are taking up to 12 to 16-hour shifts, only getting about a couple hours of sleep, and then doing that 12 to 16-hour shift all over again, because places are hit pretty hard. And Worcester, Massachusetts, specifically in the county, is expected to hit hard, mainly because all of the places around us, specifically Boston and Chelsea specifically, have a lot of cases. The healthcare workers are overworked. And when it comes to the furloughing at St. Vincent's Hospital, it's the way that the healthcare system is set up in the United States is that it's more so pretty much every single facility is part of a larger network. So, for example, St. Vincent's Hospitals is part of a larger company called Tenet. And Tenet is most likely looking at this as more of a systemic-wide thing, instead of addressing the local needs that each healthcare facility needs in response to their local community. So even though currently right now St. Vincent's Hospital, in terms of ICU workers, maybe not be as hit as others, but they're trying to save pay cuts and save money from where they're getting overwhelmed elsewhere. So they actually announced this, well, not announced this, but they were trying to do furloughs 3 weeks ago. And the M&A, the Massachusetts Nurses Association, was negotiating with them to not furlough, but to retrain nurses to deal with the ICU. And the reason why they wanted to furlough in the beginning, in the first place, is that due to executive order for the state of Massachusetts, and depending on your state, some states have this executive order, some don't, that non-elective healthcare procedures are not to be allowed to perform. It's this priority over COVID-19. So, for example, I know someone at my workplace who has a kidney stone that is affecting his job, but he can't get that surgery or treatment because it's not COVID-19 related. And in the healthcare industry in the United States, it's very specific about what you're trained to do. And oftentimes that's what contracts negotiate in order to secure safety for workers. And so what this kind of does, because it's going against profits, the healthcare companies like Tenet at St. Vincent's Hospital do not want to retrain nurses in order to deal and work better in the ICU units, which is a horrible problem, because you basically have a significant section of the workforce that is going to get vastly overwhelmed as more cases are coming in from the county into the main city to go to places like St. Vincent's Hospital is just the second most important hospital facility next to UMass Memorial, right? So the fact that, they're willing to let one section get overwhelmed and then not train the other, because if they're training the other, they have to pay them more. Obviously, the more experience and the more training you get, it makes sense to pay them more. And so they're not willing to do that. So for about 3 weeks, they were negotiating. And the M&A was standing their ground. They weren't willing to budge, as far as I'm understanding. And so Tenet essentially walked away from the negotiating table and then announced voluntary furloughs, where even though they weren't going to do mass furloughs and say, you're furloughed, they are asking people to do voluntary furloughs, and some have accepted it. And there is a genuine reason why some are accepting it. Some nurses feel very unsafe. They personally have, some of them have immune system problems where if they got it, they would most likely die. And also some of them are thinking about the people that they're living with. And it also brings into a greater need that the current healthcare system that we have, because it's based on profit, they run healthcare facilities like St. Vincent's Hospital very, very thin. If anyone has any experience going to, even when it gets to emergency care, it's not really emergency care. You're sitting there for 3 to 6 hours waiting for a nurse to get to you because they won't staff them correctly. And so basically, this is the reality at St. Vincent's Nurse Hospital. So a lot of, like I was saying before, they're working very long hours. So it is understandable why they are leaving, but they're not leaving because they don't want to do their job or taking the voluntary furlough because they don't want to do their job. It's because they're overworked. They're pretty much working these people to the brink of death in some cases. There is even a suicide of a top healthcare official in New York who was working on this stuff. She killed herself even though she had no signs of mental illness, no signs of any need to do that or want to do that, but she sadly took her own life. And this is the reality of the healthcare service. So when they tended to get back on the main thing, my apologies, when Tenet walked away, the M&A decided to release this pamphlet, this leaflet. It's very well worded, actually, to educate their rank and file about some of the lies that Tenet is doing. There's even a YouTube video where one of the Tenet's corporate officials is trying to explain and justify their reasoning for furloughs, and thank God it's not getting any traction. So when they announced that stepping away, it was released in the TNG, the Telegram and Gazette. It's a fairly popular local news in New England in general. And the M&A, it got pretty big. People were very pissed. And so there was local activists who organized this protest caravan. We obviously can't protest out in space because we could get it ourselves. So we had over 100 people. It was pretty great. Circle around St. Vincent's Hospital. A lot of people had signs on their cars. We had signs as independent socialist groups supporting the nurses, pointing out the contradictions, highlighting our demands of increased pay, more safe and consistent PPE, and to compensate and maintain the wages of nurses who do actually have to leave their job for one reason or another, mainly if they're immunocompromised, and also if they need rest from being overworked so hard. And it was a pretty big thing. And sadly, the M&A is only waiting until Tenet responds to do actions. We do think that they should be doing more about this and organizing consistent protest caravans. That might be the main mode of protest right now, due to the coronavirus, but we will support them in actions that they want to do. If it's, supporting the workers and putting more pressure. The EAW, the Education Association of Worcester, it's the union for teachers and educators. They are organizing another protest caravan to support healthcare workers in general. That's going to circle around St. Vincent's and UMass Memorial. And part of what they're saying is to, stop the voluntary furloughs, to get more training for these nurses to work in the ICU unit. So it seems like there is some people organizing around that issue, and we're definitely going to be at that May 6th rally.
No, what it indicates, Evren, very clearly is that with these attacks, there's a question of fightbacks by workers taking place. Now, Tanya, maybe we could come to looking to the future a little bit in the US. We have the presidential elections in November, and we have a president who is really running his administration like a royal dynasty being established around Donald Trump, who, of course, as is well documented now, suggested people should inject themselves with bleach as a means of protecting themselves against the coronavirus. He seems increasingly to resemble Louis XVI in France prior to the French Revolution in 1789, or maybe the court around the Russian Tsar at the time of the Russian Revolution. We've seen protests at the same time against the lockdown. Some of them have been armed. Maybe something that hasn't been so generally reported in the capitalist media is that there's been counter-protests organised, especially by health workers. We've had the mayor of Las Vegas, who's put forward the somewhat dystopian version almost of the Hunger Games, are suggesting that they end social distancing as an experiment just to see what happens and see how many people die and to see what the consequences of it are. Now, against that background, Tanya, what are the prospects for Trump and the Republicans in the upcoming elections in November?
Thank you. So, yes, we did see protests around the country just over a week ago to reopen the economy. And these protests seem to be backed by ultra-rich capitalists with ties to the same well-funded ultra-conservative organizations that were behind the Tea Party in the United States. But Trump has been jumping on this bandwagon, tweeting to his supporters to liberate Michigan, Minnesota, and Virginia, whose Democratic governors are still grappling with the crisis. And so these protests actually happened in Democratic and Republican states, but Trump has been trying to use it to build his support and to attack Democratic governors. And so the thing about these protests is that while they are funded and backed by these ultra-rich conservative forces, they also reflect the real economic anxieties of working and middle classes who are being exploited by the capitalist class. So, for example, one worker said, "In my opinion, not being able to provide for your family is 100 times bigger health crisis than any virus." And so in a situation where we have a very sparse social safety net in the US, and people see working as sort of the only way, and so a lot of people want to reopen the economy so that they can provide for their families. Unfortunately, we've seen, for example, Kentucky experienced its highest single-day spike in coronavirus cases after the protest there, and they don't seem to have spread, although there was one in Massachusetts in a rural county this past weekend. And so turning to Trump and Trump's response, we can't rule out Trump being reelected at this point. So we've seen recent attacks on democratic rights under the cover of COVID-19. So, for example, the New York State has canceled their Democratic Party primary. And Trump has also seen a bump in his approval ratings during the crisis, including people approving of his handling of the crisis. Although another poll showed that some people think he was slow to respond. And he's used this in other ways. For example, he has been appealing to his base by stoking racism against the Chinese, calling coronavirus the China virus, etc. And he was finally able to implement his immigration ban under the cover of COVID-19, which is only for 60 days for now, but will likely be extended. Another source of some popularity for Trump during this is that he actually initially outflanked Democratic Party leaders from the left with his discussions of providing stimulus to individual Americans. And he actually went as far as to have his name signed on all of the checks. Other Republicans, while some, for example, Massachusetts governor, continue to distance themselves from Trump, others are actually praising him. So Corky Messner, a candidate for the U.S. Senate in New Hampshire, actually said of Trump that his bold early actions like the travel ban have helped limit the effect of coronavirus on American soil. We need to be supportive of him at this critical time, unlike the Democrats who continually criticize the president no matter what he does. So we're seeing this coming together, sort of like patriotism, support the president in a time of crisis, like what we sometimes see during times of war or after 9/11. But then on the other hand, another Republican figure, the lieutenant governor of Texas, actually suggested that elderly people should sacrifice themselves for the economy. He said he would be willing to sacrifice himself to save the economy for his grandchildren. And that type of rhetoric is not popular. Additionally, just 14% of recently polled respondents thought that we should ease social distancing requirements. 76% of Americans thought we should continue social distancing. And so there is the possibility that if Trump continues calling for everything to reopen on May 1st, and we do see a reopening of the economy, this could cause a disastrous second wave of the virus, which could do serious damage to the Republicans.
Yes, I think that's true, and it's obviously a very explosive and unpredictable situation, as you've indicated. Now, the question is, of course, if Trump's standing, what's the alternative? And we have the Democrats. It now looks, well, it's certain that Joe Biden will be the alternative candidate from the Democrats to challenge Trump. But to what extent can we really say that Biden and the Democrats offer a real alternative? Sanders has withdrawn from the race now, probably mistakenly. He tried to chart a course through the Democratic Party. And is there the prospect now of building a new Workers' Party in the United States, which obviously would be crucial for a serious challenge to be waged against the Trump administration? So, Jai, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. Fundamentally, the Democratic Party has really failed to represent any serious alternative to the Republicans and to Trump, particularly on the question of the COVID-19 relief, which is on everyone's mind and has really taken center stage over the elections themselves. As Tanya alluded to, in the early talks about the first stimulus bill, Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives, was truly to the right of Trump on the question of stimulus for a very long period of time in its sort of early days, which was very much became a sticking point in much of progressive circles as well as conservative circles as well. Really, the Democrats' only claim to fame during this crisis is recently putting forward a measly $480 billion stimulus bill to give small businesses low-interest loans. This new bill, comes after the previous bill ran out of money and was exploited by, major corporations through various loopholes. But this bill has also been put forward, weeks into the epidemic, long after many small businesses have already been forced to close down, lost their revenue, missed rent payments, etc. We've already talked about how the individual stimulus checks are woefully inadequate. Truly, the most radical action on the part of the Democrats really has been progressive Democrats Elizabeth Warren and Ro Khanna proposing some legislation giving guaranteed sick time and guaranteed PPE protections for everyone who is continuing to work during the crisis. But this plan has existed in some form for over a week now, but the broader Democratic Party has really not taken out this proposal at all. And Warren and Khanna have really failed to initiate any sort of building, any sort of energy around this proposal amongst the working and middle classes, and instead has really just resigned themselves to sending emails and just holding out their heart of hopes that the Democratic leadership will eventually come around to it, which does not seem to be the case. I think also sort of the progressive forces, Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, Warren, etc., have all fallen in line in support of Biden, which is particularly interesting because Biden hasn't been seen in public really in about a month since the crisis really started, and has showcased really no leadership in the wake of the crisis, and hasn't presented really any policy or shown any public support for COVID relief bills. So fundamentally, I think it's becoming clearer and clearer to people that Biden does not present a real alternative to Trump. His politics are in fact very aligned with Clinton, who was the nominee this past election cycle in 2016, both in terms of his political history in supporting imperialist wars like in Iraq, and Biden being openly opposed to any type of national health service, which he's gone on record saying and continues to say. And even in his early political history, having ties to segregationist Southern Democrats, and in more recent history, avidly supporting the really universally hated 1994 crime bill that facilitated the creation of our sort of modern mass incarceration and expanding racist policing around drug policy. And we also should remember that, Biden was Obama's vice president, which I think is easy to forget because it feels like so long ago, and largely supported all of the things that Biden did, including, expanding imperialist wars in the Middle East, expansion of criminalizing undocumented immigrants, violent repression of anti-police brutality demonstrations, continued austerity, bailing out Wall Street, et cetera, et cetera. But the pressures of lesser evilism are going to weigh strongly in this upcoming election because of the widespread unpopularity of Trump. But really, the fundamental issue with the Democratic Party is their entire strategy, much like back in 2016, is we aren't Trump, and sort of this mood of vote blue no matter who is really the only thing they have going for them. There lacks any real substance to the Biden's campaign in terms of differentiating itself politically. The program is entirely sort of flimsy. It's platitudes really that. Very similar to Clinton's in that sense, and will really fail to gain any echo amongst the working class. And he will likely fail to really seriously campaign as Clinton did. It's also recently resurfaced that Biden has a few credible sexual harassment and sexual assault allegations against him, which further blurs the lines between him and Trump, who has settled multiple sexual harassment and assault allegations out of court, and that really became a major political sticking point back in 2016 as well for Trump. So this sort of blurring the lines further between how different are these candidates really. And kind of stepping back a bit, it really can't be ruled out that Trump may use the pandemic to try and justify delaying the election instead of having it in November, which would really spark its own crisis in the legitimacy of sort of U.S. capitalist democracy, but cannot be sort of thrown out. It should also be noted that that it really can't be ruled out that due to the significant unpopularity of Biden, similar to the phenomenon of Clinton, that the Democratic Party, in its undemocratic structure, may choose to draft some other more likable candidate, like say Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, for example, to replace Biden in the run-up.
So we obviously have a very open situation there. So in terms of the run-up to the election, which will probably be very polarized, and probably we will look towards the development towards a new Workers' Party in the US. Probably the other side of the election has been the more likely development now because of Sanders' failure to take action before to build a party. And obviously central in that process will be the trade unions, not necessarily the trade unions at national level in terms of the apparatus, But the question of the unions and the struggle of the workers is of crucial importance in the run-up to the election and afterwards. And Evren, you work at UPS. We've seen the strikes at Amazon, protests by workers in General Electric and other workplaces. What is the mood of the American working class at this stage? And how have the trade union leaders faced up to this position? And what does the Independent Socialist Group demand that they should be doing?
Yeah, so the mood of workers right now in the United States is very mixed in terms of what we're seeing people do. There is definitely a lot of panic and a lot of fear going on in the United States because of the uncertainty of the crisis. Even when you look in state governments like Massachusetts or New York, where they're actually doing comprehensive measurements, there's still a sense of dread. There's still a sense of nervousness. It's really not enough. Nowhere in the United States is doing enough. And so as happens in the United States, there's a significant section of workers who just feel like they can't do anything. They feel they're so restricted. They feel so hopeless to the point where I mentioned earlier, some are sadly taking their lives. However, that doesn't mean that there's nothing going on. As you even alluded to yourself, there's definitely a significant amount of protests going on currently. Now, this data or like these numbers are a little week old, but it's still substantial to the point where 95 wildcat strikes in some way, shape, or form have happened across the United States in response to horrible preparations that companies have doing, not dealing with the coronavirus enough. And there's a variety of mostly sick-ins or call-outs, but also people just straight up walking out of their job, like we've seen with Amazon, how demanding hazard pay, demanding PPE, demanding more protection when it comes to keeping your job if there's a retaliation of organizing, or if you really can't be working here, you can't have the risk because of yourself or someone in your household, so you have to leave. And in terms of the unions, it really depends on your union, but for the most part, it seems that the union bureaucracy that it dominates the leaderships that have been colluding with companies are now stepping away from those companies and getting very, very intense about getting certain protections. So, for example, the Teamsters, my union, there's been a lot of talks, a lot of stressful talks from what I've heard from my shop steward, who she's, very exhausted herself of just getting 2 weeks paid vacation, protecting workers from absences related to coronavirus, of getting the necessary PPE. In my warehouse specifically, it's still not enough. There's not safety precautions. So even though they do provide hand sanitizer, they're not, spraying it, not having people come out of the truck and wash themselves and then go into the next one or anything like that. We're also seeing, ATU bus drivers locally in Worcester. They went in an informational picket to get certain programs to protect themselves from the coronavirus. Part of that was making public transportation free. We're hoping to see that extended, and we're definitely going to be supporting them with that. We've even seen unorganized workers like Amazon, but also McDonald's go on strike or walkouts in certain places for hazard pay. We've seen Instacart, a food application on your phone that delivers groceries. They went on a strike for one day. And so there are workers on the move. The problem is that it's not so much coordinated or connected with each other. They're almost isolated at a sense. And so for us, what we think that unions should be doing is, definitely keeping the pressure of where they are now, but taking the steps further to demand much more comprehensive programs and protections for workers that mirror what other countries are doing. Canada, Venezuela are perfect examples of neighbors on the same continent dealing with much more better precautions, and also doing more action. Like, we need to be more willing to do walkouts, to do sit-ins, to do strikes, to call them indefinitely, even if we're working in places like logistics, where my warehouse, it's situated in a very geopolitically important place. I mean, everything that's going in and out of New England goes through this warehouse, as well as the one in Chelsea and Chelmsford. But even though it would be dangerous, quote unquote, for the goods getting distributed, a strike, if we had one, would be much more powerful. Even just a walkout would be much more powerful and make the whole thing go more efficient, as we saw with UAW workers out in the General Electric who were demanding that their workplace do ventilators. And so what this would kind of require and what we're kind of pushing for in unions is in order to really make this stuff a reality, unions need to come together alongside left socialist organizations and other progressive organizations and local communities to establish some kind of conference where we can put forward and develop a strong workers program and field candidates in elections, local, regional, national, in order to win these victories, but also organize workplaces to be much more connected, to be taking the willing action, and to take more charge in our workplaces to secure better protections. And a lot of this require a lot of change, but it's not like these aren't things feasible. I mean, in my union, there are trust funds that people can rank and file can donate to, that go towards campaigns both of independents, Republicans, and Democrats that are quote unquote labor friendly. In reality, these are very low programs, the low requirements. And so some of it's even just a question of just moving resources into another thing where we field our own candidates to be demanding this stuff. So even though unions are starting to go in the move, we would like to see them move faster and be much more direct and much more militant with how they're organizing, and to also be in solidarity with each other. There's no reason why the McDonald's workers and the Amazon workers can't coordinate and strike and organize together. So that's kind of, where things are going. It is very, very possible that because of this crisis, we could see an explosion of a new labor movement, especially when things start to die down. And I feel like because of how impactful this crisis is, we could see the framework and the grounds for a new labor party in the United States.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, obviously the whole of US society has been thrown into convulsions, and the issue of an alternative to capitalism, which is being posed internationally, but particularly in relation to the US, is also partly being reflected, is it not, in a growth for the sentiment and the broad idea of socialism. So, Jai, what's your thoughts on, very briefly, on the prospects for winning support for socialism and the socialist program during and after this pandemic?
Yes. So the collapse of the Sanders campaign has removed what was for quite a while the electoral lightning rod, so to speak, for broad interest in socialism, however ill-defined and confused sort of conscious around what socialism really is in the US, which is, not dissimilar to the trends going on internationally. But fundamentally, sort of these issues of socialist policies and popularity of fighting for a more democratic society and removing sort of the profit from the way in which our society functions has only grown. I think most acutely this can be seen in the form of, as Tanya alluded to, as a drive for a national health service has gained a wider echo as the simultaneous occurrence of sort of the pandemic, in which healthcare is so clearly, obviously needed, and the massive losses of jobs in the country where our entire healthcare system is tied to employment, has really clearly demonstrated how illogical and inefficient and really anti-human the U.S. healthcare system is. And it's becoming widely accepted, as Tanya mentioned, that the government should be taking an active role in healthcare. So the prospect of developing a national health service and nationalizing the current health insurance companies is a very real prospect on the horizon. Also, raising the minimum wage is really also ripe to advance in consciousness. There's been a universal fight for hazard pay of essential workers who are putting their life at risk to keep people fed and to keep the economy functioning, as has been demonstrated by, how this historically the incredibly low-paid work of these crucial crucial service workers, how important it is, and how it will likely result in an increased support for higher minimum wage after the pandemic. There's also this question of democratic planning, which has been put squarely, sort of more clearly on the table, as GE workers have been fighting for control over how production is organized and demanding that rather than being laid off, that GE allow them to create ventilators, which are clearly needed clearly finding what is necessary. The question of vaccine production and better access to testing for coronavirus is on many workers' minds and may lead to a prospect of even nationalizing pharmaceutical companies being more squarely put on the table. As these companies scramble to profit off of the crisis rather than cooperate and pooling their resources. And currently, there's just really no alternative to Trump and the Republicans, as discussed earlier. The Democrats have not demonstrated political leadership. Sanders has capitulated to the establishment and his endorsement in further corralling people toward Biden. So the objective conditions of capitalism have and will result in an increased growth in socialist ideas in a very broad sense. And this is perhaps best indicated by the growth of broad left organizations such as DSA, which has seen its membership explode both on paper and in terms of on-the-ground presence. Ultimately, this is sort of, the U.S. is faced with sort of this fundamental crisis of leadership, politically speaking. And since there is no mass political vehicle for the working class in which to wage these important political debates amongst our class, this is a major impediment to sort of the advancement of the needs of the working class. So really the immediate tasks that lie before us are building such a workers' party, building its bud, its embryo in the form of, as Evren was going into local independent elections, coordinated with unions and with community organizations to demonstrate that politics can exist outside of the corporate duopoly of the Democrats and Republicans, and preparing politically and fighting for and advocating for the coalescence of these local organizations and candidates into a broader regional and national party of and by the working class, independent of capital in terms of money and in politics as well. And in the experience of ISG alone, we are seeing, wrapping up a bit, we are growing, in the wake of the crisis and have gotten a number of contacts and people interested in learning about the methods of Marxism. We've received interest, in our recently launched website, independentsocialistgroup.com, from people, across the country who are fed up with the abuses of capitalism and are seeking a real alternative that currently does not exist. The contradictions of capitalism have become more pronounced by the day. And even workers and youth who were previously apolitical are forced to contend with the grim reality of a system that is continuing to put more money into the pockets of the few while millions lose their jobs, millions lose their health care, and yet are still expected to pay rent and to go about as if everything is normal. And from the crisis, the U.S. working class and all serious revolutionary socialists will emerge from this crisis strengthened and ready to fight against the chaos of capitalism. The prospect of a socialist United States and a socialist world is really only becoming clearer.
Good. Well, I mean, that's from this horrific situation, there is a certain optimism in terms of what could emerge in terms of building a socialist alternative. So there's a lot more to explore and discuss in the US and the situation internationally as well. But we'd like to give many thanks to Tanya, Jai and Evren for joining us. So thanks very much for participating today in this live broadcast from the CWI. And we'll be back next week. And of course, if you want further information, if you're watching in the United States, contact the International Socialist Group at their website. If you'd like to follow more analysis and news reports at the CWI, contact us at socialistworld.net, and we'll look forward to further discussions. One of the discussions we'll be exploring next week is how this crisis is impacting on Africa. We'll have socialists from Nigeria and from South Africa to explain the horrors that capitalism means during this crisis and what the socialist alternative is. So we thank our viewers for watching. We hope you join us again next week at 3 o'clock London time next Tuesday when we'll be discussing developments in Africa. And in the meantime, we'd appeal to you to stay safe, continue struggling for the rights of working people, and join us in the CWI in a struggle to build a socialist world as an alternative to the barbarism of capitalism that we see unfolding at the present time.